And this is one of the cardinal sins of new dynasty players.
Then you're going to be left in what is probably going to be, I don't want to say a perpetual rebuild, but a long-term rebuild.
That's just a poor mindset, in all honesty. And that's something I think every single dynasty player, when they start dynasty, is probably guilty of.
I'm not a person that lives life scared.
Put that on a fucking shirt.
There are so many mistakes that are made in Dynasty.
And so many of those mistakes are made right in your startup draft, which I would say is obviously one of the worst places to be making mistakes. So stay tuned to make sure you're avoiding these very common mistakes in your next startup draft. Let's get you off on the right foot in the next one. As always, I do hope you all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself, and let us know what mistakes you've made in the past so we can help others. But hey, with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for. We've done a lot of strategic videos discussing how we attack our dynasty startups. Now we're going to talk about some of the mistakes we see in a lot of our dynasty startups. First one I got that I see a lot is not paying attention to league scoring and league settings right when you get into the league. And this is one of the cardinal sins of new dynasty players and just people in general. They're just so excited to get in a league. Let's draft, let's go, let's have a good time. And then we're halfway through the second round and we're like, oh, somebody's like, oh, this is a super flex league. This is a tight end premium league, and everybody, all the quarterbacks are going and nobody understands why. So easily one of the quickest ways to get yourself into a hole from day one. League settings and scoring dictate how teams are formed overall. If you choose to neglect what these settings dictate, it will quickly be clear that your team is not up to snuff with the other teams in the league because they've built the right way and yours isn't built in a way that's conducive to scoring fantasy points in that league settings. Zach, what are your thoughts here? Is this something you see pretty frequently as well? I know we just did a Patreon draft where we had some of these issues kick up for us, but what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is something I would say a lot of people have been guilty of, right? I've definitely found myself in a startup draft and been like, what? These things have happened to us all. I think Dynasty, for a lot of people that are watching these videos, is somewhat of a new thing in the last 2 years. I think a good majority of the people watching this channel have just picked up Dynasty. Like every time we do an audit, for the most part, the previous year standings, there are none because it's a new team. So definitely something to be aware of, keep track of, and know before like the draft is over. We had an issue where, our patron league was a 2-point per reception for tight ends, and nobody knew about it except for me. Everyone was like, why do you have Dalton Schultz and Hawkinson and Austin Hooper and Travis Kelce? I'm like, well, I'm getting 2 points per catch. We've all done it. We've all been there, but definitely something to be aware of because it could really be the catalyst for you starting a rebuild because you didn't know what the league scorings were and now you're behind the 8 ball. So yeah, definitely something very important. Know what you're signing up for. I know we're all eager to join new leagues and do startup drafts and get into that process of a new league, but just know what you're jumping into. And make sure before you make your first pick, you know what the league scoring.
Absolutely, 100%. The fix here, this is not a time to zig while others zag. If it's a super flex league, I would not recommend, punting quarterback completely. If you want to draft one high and go kind of light the rest of the way and not, spend a ton of draft capital getting a quarterback. But at the end of the day, I want at least one elite quarterback on my team in a super flex league. In general, I want an elite quarterback on my team. But, always thoroughly check the league settings before you draft and establish some sort of game plan that, creates a conducive team build to how to score fantasy points in that league under those league settings. If you're on Sleeper, something you can do is check scoring leaders from the previous season. So you can filter out to last season's leaders and basically scroll through, who scored the most points, what positions are scoring points. And you can kind of set up a queue, with the little watch list stars. And, this isn't necessarily a queue that should be taken to the letter. It's just something that's kind of a guideline to give you an idea of how the scoring impacted certain positions, players, and things like that. And the last thing, make sure you're taking into account your scoring formats or on top of your scoring formats, if there are premiums, and definitely what your starting lineup requires. Is it a super flex, 2 quarterback, 3 wide receiver, 2 tight ends? Are you starting 8, 9, or 10 players, etc.? There's so much to take into account and take inventory of that are all very important. And if you leave with nothing else today, making sure you're tuned into your league settings is probably the biggest thing to note right away getting into your new league.
You want to know what the league favors, right? There's a reason for different scorings. Superflex is because single quarterback means that quarterbacks aren't that valuable. So Superflex means quarterbacks are more valuable. Know why the league scoring is that way. A full PPR means that touchdowns aren't necessarily as important as they are in half-point PPR.
Sure.
Tight end premium means tight ends are as important as wide receivers and running backs because they get more points per catch. A big one that not a lot of people know is, like, does your league reward a point for a first down? Does your league award a point or a half point per carry or whatever it may be? Because that will weigh the outcomes of who gets drafted and when. And you need to know that because that is your leg up on everybody else. Fantasy football, it's a big recipe, right? It's like there's a little bit of luck involved in fantasy football. There's a lot of research done in fantasy football, but there's a psychological aspect that if you have an advantage over somebody because you've done some homework, that's going to make you all the better. We talk about that a lot. It's something I'm very keen on, is like just that extra few minutes of detail, whether it's cultivating relationships in your league, whether it's knowing the scoring, whether it's, if your league has a kicker and a defense, looking 5 weeks ahead. It's all these things that matter in fantasy football. And so knowing the league scoring, but what does it mean? Again, super flex, quarterbacks are more valuable than anything. A full point PPR, you can get away with like a DJ Moore who doesn't score as many touchdowns, but could get 7-8 catches a game, for example. So it's very, very important and just gives you that extra edge in terms of making you a better fantasy team over somebody else.
Any leg you can get up on anybody, it's huge. You touch on luck, and that is absolutely a thing in fantasy football. But the thing is if you kind of build out your roster so strong that you can kind of eat some luck or lose some luck, and you can still surpass your opponent because you have several positional advantages, things like that. And it's not always a foolproof thing. Like I said, luck is hard to beat when it's not on your side, but it is one of those things to, take every advantage you possibly can, and every single advantage really counts. Moving on to the next point here, the next bit I have is a key thing that I think a lot of new fantasy or new dynasty players do that are coming from redraft or just in general is drafting too young, too much. Now, this, along with the next talking point, are cardinal sins of new dynasty players. Hey, man, it's dynasty. I'm going to have these players forever, so I only want to draft young players. That's just a poor mindset, in all honesty. And that's something I think every single dynasty player, when they start dynasty, is probably guilty of, unless they do the next thing I'm going to talk about. But while some young players are absolutely worth prioritizing and building around, like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, you could argue Jonathan Taylor, and all these quarterbacks if it's super flex, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. But at the end of the day, the sexy young players aren't always the ones scoring fantasy points. Sure, at some point, yes, it's expected that these guys will take off. But if you want to win in fantasy, you need points, not just a flashy roster.
I think the most important thing here is, and I talk about this all the time, people are probably going to be really annoyed at it, is like, know your plan, right? Sure. Some people's plan in a startup draft is, hey, I'm going for it year one. And that's going to lead into our next point. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going for it year one. I don't care if it's Tom Brady. I don't care if it's Adam Thielen. Like, these guys are going to score points. And that's perfectly fine, because if you win 1 year, you've paid the league dues for a decade. But like, what is your plan, and how do you plan to execute it? The problem with going too young is that you shy away from players who can score points that are older because they're older.
Yep.
And at some point, you got to know like when to go all in, right? This is more like a post-startup draft topic, but it's okay to go young, but you also need points. Like, look at the guys that were drafted last year in the rookie draft. There's no Jamar Chase. There's no Jalen Waddle right now. There's players that look great. There's no doubt about that. But there's no immediate Justin Jefferson prospect. So you have to be able to ride that fine line of, hey, I need to also be able to score points to compete for a championship this year. I'm all for building for the next 5 years. I am all for it. But at the same time, you need some of those older players to help you win championships. I'll give you an example. There was a league where last year I had the 101. I've talked about this league before. I traded back. I drafted Olave at 108. I picked up Michael Pittman in the second round pick in next year's draft. I just traded for Cooper Kupp, and he's not going to help me this year. And I am a playoff team in that league. But I'm also looking at, this team is probably good enough to compete, but not good enough to win a championship. And if Cooper Kupp is 90% of what he was this year, next year, that puts me immediately in a championship conversation. So you got to know when that fine line is, whether it's drafting in a startup, whether it's trading after the startup, as to I want to build young and maintain this relevance for 5 years in my dynasty league, but I also want to try to compete this year and next year, and I can't do that with young developing players as well. So I am a big draft young guy, but at the same time, you have to go in on some older players. There's DeAndre Hopkins, there's Adam Thielen. These guys are in their 30s, but they will score you points. Hell, Latavius Murray, that dude's a cockroach. He will never go away in terms of fantasy relevance. He's a 31-year-old running back that every year gets picked up week 4 and is somehow relevant, and you have to embrace that. You can't not pick up Latavius Murray because I drafted James Cook or whatever it may be. Like you have to be open to bringing players on your team that will score points to help you win a championship.
I like that a lot. Something to consider is some of the sexy names that were drafted last year. You look at Javonte Williams, Kyle Pitts, just for two names going in the top 3 rounds in startup drafts, super flex startup drafts, and last year as rookies, going very, very unrealistically high, and none of those guys won you championships last year. And now fast forward to this year, this is without this year context because we would have projected those guys to take off at some point. Obviously, they've kind of hit a speed bump in that, but it is about, filtering out some talent into that roster. But the fix for this, typically this is really just a mindset issue and just a basic mistake. It just, you're thinking so long-term, you're not thinking about what could be right in front of you. And in my opinion, the first year in Dynasty is probably the easiest one to win. And the reason for that is because of people who just draft for the future. And then it leaves so much wide open where, if you're looking to trade up and get an elite player, there's probably somebody looking to trade down that you can go and get that player, pay up a pick next year, and whatever pick was your next pick, go get that player. And on top of all that, you have such a small disparity in the league, usually first year, where it's pretty even, because even if you move all over the draft board, there's not usually going to be teams that are just crazy out the gate or really bad out the gate. Rarely do you have teams that are, scoring 50 more points than others week to week. Usually it's, closer. So there's just more chance that you can actually get your foot in the door, get in the playoffs, and go win a championship. If you're trying to win at some point, drafting solely based on youth shouldn't be your goal. Drafting guys like AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, Jalen Waddle before they became those guys should not be your primary goal, at least not early on in your drafts. Instead, just draft those guys, AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, Jalen Waddle. All in all, I'm not saying draft old players or avoid young ones, but take the value when it's given. Don't pass up on DK Metcalf, who is still very young by league standard, just because Drake London exists. You can draft young with DK and still snag a player who's producing now and is still relatively young that you can immediately set as a cornerstone piece of your roster.
I just think that the key to building a championship team is always going to involve young players and older players. You're never going to win with an all-young team, and I really don't think you're going to win with an all-old player team because young players tend to break out later in the season when older players are getting hurt. I'll bring up another Cooper Kupp reference, right? Cooper Kupp is hurt now, later in the season. There are younger players who are starting to ascend to the draft projections. Listen, we're recording this after James Cook finally had a relevant game. We've seen Rachaad White starting to take over the backfield. So you need that perfect blend of, you can have more older players than young. That's fine. We're going to talk about that in a second. You can have more younger players than old players, but you need both. You have to have a good blend of both. And like you said, don't ignore players that are scoring points because you think this player will be a player that scores points in a few years. You have to find the fine line between the two to make you competitive. But if you're like me in a dynasty, you want to be relevant for more than 1 year, which is going to lead into our next point.
Yep. Speaking of which, let's talk about our next point. And this one is the flip side of that coin, which I see as well. Drafting too old, too much, too early. If you're really used to redraft, I like to call this the redraft mindset. Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to go all in year one, that's fine. This is not a targeting that or, disparaging that strategy because it is a legit one. But this is for the players who go into a dynasty league and make the mistake of solely focusing on current production and don't take age into consideration when drafting. Now, as I touched on in the previous point, this is a great way to accumulate fantasy points and possibly win a championship in year one. However, as you just touched on, we want to build with some longevity in mind. So at the end of the day, we want to pair the two. We want to pair some old with little young and players in the middle. Players that are 25, 26, that's like the prime of players' careers. 25 through like 28 is a great time to have a player. Running backs, it's maybe 24 to 26, and then you can get some golden years out of guys. Pairing the 2 points, if you're so used to redraft, Derrick Henry was going like the third round of most startup drafts this offseason, startup mock drafts and drafts this offseason. But if you're a redraft player and you see Derrick Henry sitting there at the top of the second round, you're going to be stoked, especially if you're not necessarily paying attention to the ADP, or you're just not, used to really how long running backs last in Dynasty. You're going to look at that as a huge value, and you're going to scoop that up. And yes, you might have a good year one with a good running back, but the wheels are going to fall off at some point. I'm not going to be the guy setting out bets for when that happens because Derrick Henry seems like a freak. But that's just a prime example, I think, of what kind of happens in this mindset. What are your thoughts here, Zach, on drafting too old, too much, too early? Something I think is kind of another rookie, quote unquote, rookie mistake of new Dynasty players.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at a situation in a startup draft where I'm targeting Derrick Henry in the third or fourth round, and so hypothetically, Derrick Henry, his ADP is in the third or fourth round, and you see him go in the second round. There's a positive to that, right? I know you were targeting him; he didn't fall to you, but that means that somebody else fell to you that maybe should not have been there. So that's one way to look at that, right? How can you capitalize on somebody else having that redraft mentality? Sure. You can tell immediately who's new to Dynasty in a startup draft, right? Like you can tell, right away. Now, listen, we talked about this a few minutes ago. It's okay if you want to go mostly old players, but if you don't infuse the talent on your team with players that can replace them in bye weeks, in injuries, in 2 years, then you're going to be left in what is probably going to be, I don't want to say a perpetual rebuild, but a long-term rebuild because you will have assets in 2 years that nobody is going to want to trade for. You're going to have what AJ Green is now, as opposed to what he was 3 years ago. You don't want to have, and that has no value in a dynasty league other than maybe a fourth round pick for a desperate team. So really, you want to find yourself in a situation where if your mentality is, I'm going to go older players, I'm also going to have a few players that I believe in a few years will ascend to starting caliber players. I'll give you a great example. If you drafted Khalil Herbert last year in the rookie draft, you weren't expecting, and Khalil Herbert was like a third or fourth round rookie pick, if I'm not mistaken.
If not fifth.
Yeah, you may know that better than me. But you could see, hey, listen, maybe this guy gets in because David Montgomery gets injured. Who knows? It's the same with Romeo Doubs, right? Like most people are drafted, if you were drafting in rookie drafts May or June, you were drafting Romeo Doubs fourth round, end of the third, maybe. Yeah. Look, you're not expecting anything from that player right away, but you're hoping that in 2 to 3 years, that player is starting on whatever team, and you can trade it for a second round pick or trade it for a first round pick. A lot of people drafted Dameon Pierce mid-second round last year. You could trade him for a first round pick. All you want to do is leave yourself in a position to where you are not without assets in terms of draft picks or tradable players. And you can find yourself in that situation very easily if you only go with older players. So we're not saying it's wrong to draft older players. What we're saying is don't leave yourself in a vulnerable position once these players age out and now you're in a rebuild, because older players get hurt more easily. That may leave you in a situation where you had a great start to the season. You're 8-2, 8-3, and then Cooper Kupp gets hurt and you don't have anything to replace Cooper Kupp. And now your first round pick is a late first round pick, but you're not good enough to compete for a championship. You are in no man's land. So you don't want to find yourself in that spot. And make sure that you leave yourself a little bit of room to, like we said, it's a very perfect blend of either older players with some younger talent that can ascend later in the season, that can ascend in year 2 or year 3, or if you want to go a little bit younger, that's fine, but make sure you have some pieces that can fill in if a Drake London isn't performing. Adam Thielen is a guy you could have gotten 8th, 9th, 10th round last year, and I'd be starting him every week right now over Drake London. You want to find yourself in a position to where you're not too heavy on one or the other. Not too, unless you just unless your mentality in the startup draft is, yo, I'm out year one, then that's fine if you want to find yourself in that position. But if you're trying to compete, it's got to be a healthy blend of one of the two.
Moving on to the fix for this pick, this isn't always a mistake. It just kind of a, poor mindset. And it, like I said, not always a mistake. Sometimes it's a good strategy. It makes for a formidable year one squad, depending on injuries and all that, obviously. But the idea is the intent and strategy or lack thereof. If you're going in with that strategy, you can draft old productive players. But like you said, be prepared for the future. And when that well of fantasy points dries up and you have little youth to replace what was once elite production, you're going to be in trouble. You can draft guys like Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, maybe not as much anymore, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Nick Chubb, and Travis Kelce at pretty good values in startups this past year. But just don't draft all of those guys. You don't want to stack your roster with all of those guys. They might not be a piece that you want to build around long term, but they're a piece that you can still build a year one championship team around. And then kind of evaluate from there. Once you have you have some league winnings to work with, you can maybe take a year to reassess and move on from there and, help another team go win while you get assets back for the future to help out your team that's going to need some work. Real quick, just wrapping up these previous 2 points. It doesn't have to be one or the other, building too old or building too young. And in my opinion, it really shouldn't be. If you want to build a competitive team year one and over the long term, you need a reasonable mix of young and old players. It doesn't have to be a all 21-year-old team, because guess what? That's probably not going to do much for you in points. Like I said, you need more than just a flashy paper roster at the end of the day to win a championship, which is what we're all here for. On to the next point here, and this one is being scared to trade or avoiding trading in startups. And now this is not always a mistake. Sometimes this is intentional and sometimes it's probably for the best, but we'll get into that. So I've rarely seen a good team, or rather a great team, after a startup that did not make a single trade in that startup. I'm sure it happens, but moving around the draft board, whether it's trading up or trading down, can make a huge difference for your dynasty for the long haul if you're trading down, or even if you're pushing to win year one and you're trading up. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I have some thoughts as to why people don't trade a lot in startups. I think it's usually just based on not being super familiar with trading values. We have some ways to address that, but Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
The way I approach a startup draft is there are certain players I'm targeting, and what I'm really trying not to do is overdraft them. So if I have to move back, and I know that you're a believer of this, Bob, because I've seen you do, you and I were doing the same thing in a startup draft. It was so annoying. Because I had everybody wanting to move up with me, but then there's you. Everybody's trying to move up with you. You're that guy. It's a great way to, there's different strategies, and that's why I'm in so many leagues, is I try different things, and I really like to target certain players and not overdraft them. So, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But what I really believe in is having capital after a startup draft, Bob, to make a move if you want. If you want to go and make a trade, there's going to be one person in your league that looks at their team after the startup draft and says, I don't like what I got. I got to start rebuilding. There will be one, at least one. And the way you do that is moving up and down your board or your league's startup draft and allowing teams to trade positions with you and move back. And this is we're going to lead into this point later too. It's just, not trading from the first round to the sixth round. Is kind of just moving back a little bit and acquiring. But same goes for if there's somebody you want on the draft board and you see that, hey, there's been a run on quarterbacks. I got to go get my guy. I got to go get Tua. He's going to get picked up here in the next pick or two. Don't be afraid to move up and down the draft board. Like it's all about how you maneuver the draft board, and that goes into your plan, your long-term vision, and how do you incorporate all those into one. And for me, that's always every single pick. Listen to me. Look. Zoom in if you have to. If you're in a startup draft with me, every pick is on the board. End of story.
On the block, you mean?
It's available. Here, it's on the blocks, on the board, whatever.
Fair enough. So, looking at fixes here, and I don't necessarily believe that anybody in a startup is afraid of trading or believes trading is a bad thing. I don't think anybody thinks that. I think what it boils down to is just being unsure of the value in a trade, especially with new players. Players who have done 50 startup drafts or mock drafts even have a general idea of how to evaluate picks and players and where things fall and things like that. But if you're going into your like third or fourth startup draft, even, you probably haven't even scratched the surface of what it's like being in one, especially when it comes to trading and values and things like that. To be honest, it is hard to evaluate trades in a startup when you have so many different formats you could be in. If you're unfamiliar with like a tight end premium league or a super flex league, just makes it all the more difficult. So, one thing or a couple of tricks to help do that is, one, you can find and use a trade calculator. Now, there's plenty of free ones out there. There's some paid ones out there too. I'm not a huge fan of trade calculators because when some people use them, they tend to refer to them as Bibles and ways to manipulate me into making a trade I don't want. Here, Bob, look at this trade I've just put together that is, 500 points towards your favor. Make this trade with me. No, I don't like that trade because trades are ultimately subjective. Another trick is, instead of thinking of startup picks as startup picks, look at them as the players that are going around the ADP of those picks. This way you're putting names to picks as opposed to just treating it like this second round pick and this fourth round pick in the startup, or, things like that. We'll talk about rookie picks and stuff a little more later. Lastly, if you're scared to trade, but you want to get your feet wet, trading down is much safer than trading up, since worst case, you're usually adding assets. And as long as you're not trading miles down the board, like we'll discuss in a little bit, you're still drafting worthwhile players, more than likely in the same tier, but more on that a little later, like I said. Anything else to add here, Zach?
Yeah, I think what's really important there is, and this is where we can help you out because we've got the Discord, is to have a community to go to if you're unsure.
Yep.
And there are times
I
am a trade calculator guy. I don't care. And that doesn't mean I need you to believe it. It just it's a reference point.
It's always a good guideline.
Yeah, it is the guideline. Is this close? Is this not? And plug it into 2 calculators. Plug it into 3. Make sure that the settings are right, though. Make sure that if it's a super flex league, that the calculator is able to adjust for that. It's a reference point. But if I'm ever unsure, I'm asking, and this is how you are aware of some of the trades I've made, is I take them to the Discord. We have a patron Discord where you can join, and we have a whole community. And we have an entire dialogue about a trade and why I like it and why other people don't. And I want to see other people's points of view because I'm definitely looking at a trade this way. I have my singular point of view, but what do other people see? And I don't do that for every trade, but I do it for a trade where I'm on the fence. I'm very on the fence. What does the community think about it? And that is only going to help you because other people bring in points of view that I haven't considered. Bob may have another way of thinking about it that I didn't even think about. So that is very valuable to have. It doesn't have to be, we'd love it for you to be our Discord group, a Facebook group, another league, right? Go to another league and say, hey guys, what do you think about this trade in this league that none of you are in? What do you guys think? Because having those other voices can help you just see things from another point of view is all I'm saying.
I 100%, 1000% agree with that. More minds working on a deal is better than one sometimes, and I'll even do the same thing. I usually feel pretty good about the trades I make. Usually I send them after to get them roasted. If anything, I'll drop them in there too. It's just good to, like you said, have multiple points of view. Somebody might bring up something you don't even think of. It's just good to have that community to fall back on one way or another, and dropping in other leagues, Facebook groups that you're in, whatever you can do is all huge, just to make sure, it's better to ask than make the mistake and have to learn the hard way. Follow in the footsteps of people that have already made the mistake for you and learn from them. Yep. Put that on a fucking shirt. That was a good one. Somebody's probably already said that before, but that was a good fucking quote. Next bit I got for you: not valuing assets properly, including startup picks and future draft capital, specifically the relationship between the two. This is where I'll say, if you're unsure you're valuing assets properly, maybe it is best to avoid trading. A classic case of not valuing draft picks properly is equating a startup first to a rookie first. Sadly, this is something I've seen happen quite a bit with experienced players trying to take advantage of newer players who just don't know the value disparity yet between those picks. An unknown random rookie first is closer to value with a startup fourth or fifth than a startup first round pick. And that's just, when you actually look at rookie drafts after the draft has happened, or startup drafts after the NFL draft has happened, this is where we tend to see rookies go. So that's kind of why it makes sense to equate them that way. This is a tough one because it's always hard when if you're new to Dynasty, you have to evaluate startup picks and things like that. And then you're also throwing into the mix rookie draft picks into this startup that you're already unsure of. And this is why having a community to fall back on, having a trade calculator to fall back on, just to give you an idea of what value should equate to. And one thing I'm going to say right off the rip is, somebody is sending you in a startup a trade that looks this long to read, where it's 50 assets moving either way. They are trying to screw you over. I promise. That's just what's happening. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, how we can kind of, marry the two things together, startup picks, future draft capital. How are we kind of going to equate that? And I'll get into some fixes after that.
Yeah, I'm going to say, first of all, I don't necessarily agree with like, hey, just don't trade if you don't understand value. Like,
Sure.
hey, listen,
I can agree with that.
Jump in the deep end, man. Like, figure it out. and if it's that bad, the league will let you know. We've had a situation, Bob, where we're like, not in the startup draft, but we as like the league commissioners were like, no, this is too much. Like, I don't know if this guy understands what he's doing. Listen, sometimes you just got to learn the hard way, right?
No.
And I don't want anybody to be in a bad situation, but like I'm not a person that lives life scared. Like, I just don't. I don't avoid situations because bad things happen to other people. I'm more cautious, and this is where I would say again, it's not a Bible, but it's a reference. There are trade Keep Trade Cut has a trade calculator that you can incorporate startup draft picks in. And it will let you know the value of what you're trading. But I also want to note one thing, because some people may not have understood the point of, hey, your random rookie first is not worth a startup first round pick. What do we mean by that? Breece Hall was the 101 last year. Breece Hall in startup drafts maybe went in the third or fourth round of a startup
Third round
draft.
usually. Yep.
Okay, so that's what Bob is saying. Like, if somebody wants your first round startup pick, you get their second round startup pick and something else. You do not move way back down the board, a point we're going to talk about here in a second.
Going into fixes here, like I said, or like you said, excuse me, going into the trade calculator, something to help appropriate value and give a somewhat of a guideline for you. Not a Bible again. At the end of the day, whether you use calculators or not, you should want to get a good gauge of how value works in Dynasty, working trades, things like that. There's some trade value charts out there that you can look at. I don't know how many of them have startup first round picks in them, but you could always kind of gauge the use ADP, for where X players on the board. You can take, where is Jonathan Taylor on the trade value chart? Where is he going in ADP? And you can compare picks that way. It's not going to be the same or exactly easy to do, but that is another method you can do. And I know there's some free trade value charts out there as well. Another way is to think of it like this. Even though you're drafting someone in the first round of the rookie draft, that pick you're getting back that is expected to be great someday, you're passing up on an elite level talent that you already know is an elite level talent. And then you're hoping on that first round pick that they turn into that elite talent. So it just doesn't really make sense to do it. And just like before, if you're unsure how to value that future draft capital, maybe don't use that in your trades. If you're comfortable, establishing something around like Chris Godwin, which is, probably like a 6th round pick, and, trading down from the first to the second to pick up a 6th, something like that, like all startup picks. Maybe you're more comfortable with that, not dealing with rookie picks yet. But if you are going to trade future picks as well, also very good to be plugged into the upcoming draft. That's huge. The next upcoming drafts, depending on how far you're trading out. Well, that is it for the video today. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please be like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. Be sure to let us know which of these mistakes you've made and any others you've made as well. Believe it or not, there's even more mistakes that you can make in a Dynasty startup. They just all wouldn't fit in this video. Too many people are a captive to what the ADP is.
What is your plan? And are you there at the end of the draft? Because if you find yourself in that position where the draft ends and you are not happy with your team, it's tough.
That's that tear down lateral trade that I always talk about, but in a startup draft. What I couldn't be more anti is about getting your guy over proven talent that is more likely to hold value than your guy is to gain value. Just because you drafted this team doesn't mean this has to be your team forever. Be sure to stay on the lookout for part 2 and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. If that video has already released, it'll be on your screen right now. And if it hasn't, be sure to get your fix with Zach and mine's startup draft strategy video right here. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.